That's the whole time they were building and trying to put it all together. People kept coming in. It's happy to be filmed.
Students, it's time to quiet down. Welcome to Weird 101 with our guest tonight, Thom Powell. I want to thank everybody for coming out and once again supporting not only like local Bigfooters and all that sort of stuff, but supporting the museum as well. It means a lot to us, especially during the slow, dark winter months. Business is a hard thing to ride, but you guys are really helping out a lot. So I want to thank you very, very much for your support and everything, not only in this world, but for these special events. I don't know about you, but I really enjoy these special events because it's a small group. I max out at 40. It's like my expeditions. I max out at 10 or 12 people. That's it. Because everybody gets a chance to hang out. Everybody had a chance to talk to Thom tonight. Hopefully you had a chance to have him sign a book or your forehead or whatever you're into. So thank you again. Next month, I don't know what's going on yet. I was talking to Bobo today. He's talking about coming up in the next month or two. I'm going to wait to find out what Bobo's schedule is. Although he does have a fairly elastic sense of time. It's actually very difficult even to do a podcast with him once a week. But nonetheless, when I get a date for him, we'll be doing one of these with Bobo as well. Again, so keep your eyes on social media and all that stuff, because I have no better way to get a hold of y'all. I can't do mailing lists because I exceeded the mailing list capacity immediately. They wanted $50 a month from me. I can't do that at this point. But so I don't want to talk for too long because it's not my gig, it's Thom's. But so, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming out, and let's welcome Thom, okay?
So we're going to try and do this microphone-less. It's not a very big room. I think we can do it. 8th grade science teacher, so I'm used to being heard. But if you're in the back and if you want to see the screen better, maybe you want to consider moving up now that there won't be as much traffic. But if you can't see, especially if you're trying to take some pictures, you might want to move closer to the screen. Anyway, so congratulations, first of all, go to Cliff on the establishment of his venue. So very exciting to have this, and I'm just thrilled and honored to be asked to be here, and so thank you all for having me, especially Cliff and Melissa. Anyway, you know, when you talk about Bigfoot, everybody's like, oh, come on, really, you believe in that? I'm like, well, first of all, I don't believe in Bigfoot. I don't even know if I believe in God. I just, it's not a belief. But then, of course, well, where's your proof? And this is, of course, a big problem. And just to sort of emphasize the title of my presentation, The Goblin Universe, there is a book by these two guys that talks about mainly the Loch Ness Monster, but why can't you prove the Loch Ness Monster? And when I read this book, it's very hard to find. If you ever see this in a used bookstore, buy it. It's out of print, it's very interesting. And they basically say the thing isn't always here. Sometimes they're here and sometimes they're not. And when they're here, they're definitely here, flesh and blood, they poop, they make noises. But when they're not, they're somewhere else. And so that's where he's got this little matrix drawn there that sort of speaks to that idea of the possibility, at least, that things are coming and going from our reality. So, you know, that's, I guess I'm giving myself away as a little bit woo, but I don't know, I'll attempt to explain. But before we begin, congratulations, as I said, to our host and hostess, and the museum is fantastic. But also, if you decide you want to take pictures of any or all of this, I do not care. I guess I'm like the Grateful Dead in that respect. Once I'm done with it, you can have it. So feel free to photograph, plagiarize, record, I do not care. I might suggest asking questions at the end in the off chance that I answer the question in the ensuing slides. If you bought a book from me, thank you very much. And if I cover the material or you're just outraged at what I'm saying, I'll be happy to buy the book back from you after the talk. So just sell it back to me if you want. And are there how many people have in this room have heard me speak before? Okay, so that's a little disconcerting because that means I have to change up what I say. But that's okay, I kind of anticipated that, being that I'm in sort of my home turf. And the last question I have for you is, do we have any Native Americans in the audience? Because sometimes people of that ancestry have some very interesting things to say that I've learned to. So one back there. All right, two. All right. Interesting. Any tribes? Are you familiar with your tribal affiliation?
Yeah, Sioux.
Sioux. Sioux. Okay, and they are is it Midwest, I believe.
South Dakota.
Okay, thank you. And one more person raised their hand.
That was me.
And what was your?
Mine's the Oshawa Nation from San Juan Capistrano, so there's not, I'm like probably the one that may only talk about Bigfoot because they don't mention it much.
Got it, got it. Well, I know that there's a lot of tribes. In fact, people go, oh, you know, sightings happen in every state except Hawaii. Well, actually, that's not true. It's just the Hawaiians do not talk about it. You're almost forbidden from sharing it. And so, but it does happen in all 50 states. So anyway, just briefly, you probably know by now I'm a science teacher. I started out as a Bigfoot
Chris,
skeptic.
pizza?
And
Chris, come here.
oh, there it is. I used to lampoon Bigfoot every year. Did a sort of a scientific method presentation, and I used Bigfoot as the perfect example of pseudoscience. What was interesting is I watched the movie that the school district provided for so many years, and there was Grover Krantz, you know, In Search of with Leonard Nimoy, and I watched it so many times that it started to sort of give me pause, especially the stuff that Krantz talked about, that I thought, wow, he's really suitably scientific and so on. So somewhere along the line of my 30 years in public education, I did sort of switch sides. And I think it happened when I moved to Clackamas County, because for the first time in my life I met people who said, you know, we have that right here. And I moved to a place in pretty rural Clackamas County, which was next door to where Lori grew up right here. And she has some rather odd things that happened while she was a child in that same immediate vicinity. And then I met Lori years later because she was grown just before I bought there. But once we actually traded notes, I found further verification of the fact that, Jesus, that's actually kind of an area where things go on. So once again, it gave me pause and forced me to realize I gotta see if I can't scientifically pick this scab. So being a camera buff that I was, I started doing, I just felt like if they're there, then they got these new things called trail cams. They ought to work. So I get busy and buy these things. Back then there were 600 bucks. They put film in them, and you came back, and if the camera had been advanced, then you said, well, shoot, I only took 3 pictures, but I can't stand waiting to see. So you just took the film out and then took it to Walgreens and had it processed just for 3 pictures. And usually you didn't have much. But I did start doing these cameras, and I did it for a long time. And then the Forest Service heard about what I was doing, and they asked me to be sort of a summertime consultant for their crews because they wanted to learn how these cameras were working. And so that gave me some exposure to the Forest Service, and institutionally, of course, they were very skeptical about Bigfoot. I understand that, and I didn't do anything to challenge that, but I did find that in the rank and file of Forest Service were very many people who said, oh crap, I had this one thing happen to me, and some, you know, way out back, and then up the Hood River drainage or somewhere, and so a lot of Forest Service people have experiences that only lately are they feeling a little more emboldened about talking about. But I was gathering these things even before I got involved in BFRO. And then, you know, more recently, I've sort of widened my area of interest to these other things which fall into this category that we would call paranormal. But the first book that I wrote was really just a treatment of my sort of early affiliation with the topic up until I got involved with BFRO. And then I published that, so that was 2003. Later, I think 2007 or 8, I published the Shady Neighbors book, and that's a novel, and it basically uses the Bigfoot mystery and then overlays it onto this idea of baseball. Why baseball? Well, I guess I grew up with baseball, but I found that baseball and Bigfoot actually have a lot of interesting sort of overlap in terms of how the game is played by these guys who are playing it at the highest level. And my favorite baseball player of all time is, of course, Yogi Berra, because he's the guy who had all the fantastic quotations, like "It ain't over till it's over." That's a Yogi Berra one. He used to say things like, in baseball, you don't know nothing. I'm lucky. Usually you're dead or you go to your own museum. I'm still alive to see mine. So that's what Bigfoot probably feels about Cliff's museum. Yogi Berra once said, "Little League baseball is a good thing because it keeps parents off the streets." The towels were so thick at the hotel that I could barely get my suitcase closed. If you get to a fork in the road, take it. You can observe a lot just by watching. Always go to other people's funerals, otherwise they won't come to yours. And finally, there's 3 kinds of baseball players. Those who make it happen, those who watch it happen, and those who stand there and wonder what just happened. So these are sort of Yogi Berra-isms, and I couldn't keep my hands off of that stuff, so I sort of worked it into this novel, having to do with this family that stumbles upon the Bigfoots in their immediate vicinity. And the idea is, of course, one of habituation, which is a word that just started to find favor as I was getting involved in the writing and so on. And so that led me to the most recent book where I treat these things, and they're really the edgier stuff, hence the name, and also the crossover between the topics. Anyway, paranormal entities are a very difficult thing to study scientifically, and I came to realize that after trying. In other words, I was really determined to go out there and get Bigfoot evidence, and I found that I could not. And it might be easy to suppose that, well, just because you fail doesn't mean you're paranormal, you just suck. And I'm like, okay, I thought that actually for a while, but I got so many indications over the years, and so I'll share out a little bit of that as we go. But one of the things that this book sort of features is the connection that I see between the Sasquatch topic and some of these other so-called paranormal topics. Ghosts, aliens, crop circles, UFOs, Loch Ness Monster, all of these things, and I find that there is some very interesting common ground. So first of all, you all know who that is, right? So he was kind of my hero, and I got the chance once to not only meet him, but when he came to inspect our big piece of scientific evidence as a consequence of the Skookum expedition, he was out, he excuses himself, he went outside the little community college where we had it set up, and he's standing there smoking, of course, a true cigarette. And remember the true cigarettes had a little plastic filter on them? So I couldn't resist. I went out there and bummed a cigarette from Grover Krantz. And stood there and had a good time with him, and he died within a year or two after that. So he was in pretty failing health, but he did come look at our stuff. And of course, Krantz, if you're not familiar, is one of these 4 horsemen who, along with Peter, who is familiar to some of you here locally, were the go-to guys. And they were all decidedly flesh and blood. They were looking for a wild ape. They were looking for an undisclosed primate, a zoological specimen, nothing more. But then, I did have contact with these people, some of which were borderline crazy, but who really did sort of embrace the idea of the paranormal at a very early time. He was very tactless about the way he did it, so he did not have many allies or even friends among the research community. But Kiwani lapsaritis, who some of us were talking about early tonight, also very fringe, but he has not changed his message in 35 years about what he sees as the true nature of this topic. So you got to give the guy a little bit of credit for at least consistency. And then Henry Franzoni was a local sort of legend, really, but he's decided to sort of throw up his hands and drop out of the researcher scene. But he still is around the area. He lives in Deer Island, which is a community down the Columbia River just past Caboose. But he, too, has been very helpful and very influential, and I'll get into him a little bit more. But anyway, so like I said before, do you believe in Bigfoot, Tom? Oh, no, I really don't believe in much, but I do recognize that it's an unanswered question. I'm okay with it as a species of animals, but it could be people. Actually, I favor it that it's closer to this than that. But I also feel, whoops, hold on, back up. I also feel that it is somehow aligned with this. But as I also say to people, you know, we don't know that we're not dealing with ghosts here. There are very many ghost-like aspects to the Sasquatch phenomenon in terms of the way it comes and goes effortlessly. It's very much there, and then it's not, and then its capabilities. So I don't rule out, and in fact, the tribal perspective very often represents them as a spirit being. It's got their feet in our realm and some other. And so this is what we call woo, which is short for woo-woo, which is the opposite of the flesh and blood, who Matthew Johnson disparages by calling them apers. And so, you know, the name calling is kind of also Trumpian. I prefer to avoid it, but, you know, this word paranormal is kind of new on the scene. The original word for paranormal was Fortean, because this guy, Charles Fort, was the first guy to embrace this idea of the reality of certain supernatural aspects that sort of surround the real world that we mostly inhabit. So Charles Fort was the originator of some of these ideas back in the 30s. But they did not have the word paranormal in the lexicon back then. It's kind of a more recent word. And as I said, people want to know where's your proof. So, you know, I get kind of a little bit exasperated, but I understand that it's a reasonable question to someone who's only talking to me for the first time. But I do say, well, you know, how much evidence makes proof? And the answer is there is no amount. I mean, I can show you Bigfoot evidence. There is Bigfoot evidence, but it isn't proof. In fact, there's no clear recognition of how much evidence it takes to equal proof. Proof is actually a concept that even in strict scientific circles is not, does not pertain to very many things. But that's what everybody wants. They want proof. Well, I don't have it. Anyway, flesh and blood versus paranormal. This is your typical sort of false dichotomy, really, because it may be a little of both. You can't just separate everything, but this is what Matthew Johnson would do with it. He talked about the apers versus the woo, and of course, like I say, that's a little bit too disparaging for me. But this is a thing that Henry Franzoni used to get into. He said, you want to do science on these things, you cannot, because you cannot do science on another intelligent being. And even on humans, you cannot really do science most of the time because you can't lock a person in a cage and therefore reduce all your variables to a single variable that you test for. So really, when we do science, when we try to do science, we're not always even able to do science, but you cannot do science on an intelligent being. All you can do is gather intelligence, gather intel. And so it's, I use the analogy a lot of Osama bin Laden. You know, you can't scientifically really study somebody who's going rogue and who's intelligent, but you can gather intel, and in reality, when we study Bigfoot, that is what we are doing. We are gathering intel. It's all unverifiable. But if you put together enough unverifiable elements, you can assemble a picture which has predictive power. That's what the CIA does every day. They don't do science, and they know that. Then there's the whole idea of, here's how science works. Science wants to study one thing and one thing only. Isolate the variable. That's how you do a scientific experiment. You cannot do that, or maybe you're not advised to do that, because in reality you're talking about something that has too many aspects, too many facets, too many connections to other things. So sometimes you have to study things more holistically than that, especially if you're frustrated by your inability to get somewhere. It may be because you're reducing things too much, and so you need to just broaden your picture. That is my sort of mantra over and over again. Are we dealing with extraterrestrials? Well, I'm not even sure that UFOs are extraterrestrial. I'm not convinced that UFOs are a manifestation of something that resides on Earth here with us. Maybe it resides subterranean, and this is what Henry Franzoni would insist. He said Sasquatches have to have a hideout, and it must be underground. It certainly isn't these silly stick structures that you see. I don't doubt that Sasquatches are putting little stick structures around the woods, but those things ain't shelter in any way, shape, or form. But they are there. So Henry Franzoni would say they're underground. The Native Americans say, I don't want to talk to you white folks too much about it, but they're underground. And then, of course, there is the idea that interdimensional, and I'm not always sure I know what that word even means. Interdimensional may just be how you get from here to there. It may be that even extraterrestrials are very much three-dimensional objects when they're on their home planet, but they've found a way to flock from their place to our place much shorter, much quicker than, you know, space travel, speed of light, all this Einstein stuff. So I'm not sure what that phrase always means, but it is something that we run into again and again, especially with people who say, well, I have contact with these things, and I'm here to tell you they're interdimensional. So interesting, tough to always know what to do with. But this is where I am today. This is my other mantra. I'm not looking for Bigfoot evidence anymore. I know that I can't prove it to the world. I'm already convinced that the subject has a reality. But there's something more important to me at this point than proving it to the rest of the world, and that is understanding what's going on. When you shoot for understanding as opposed to evidence, it's a very different way of going about the problem. And so this is where you sort of have to go, all right, what am I trying to do here? And what does that imply about my approach? For instance, if I'm trying to prove that Bigfoot exists, I'm not going to do it by getting with psychics, telepaths, and so on. But if I'm looking for understanding, and if I consider the possibility that psychics and telepaths can get me that, then let's go. So this is where, again, I can't, you know, I'm not looking for proof anymore, but I am looking for clues about what's really going on. Now, our guy Loren Coleman, one of the most stalwart of the flesh and blood camp, but also one of the most enduring personalities in the Bigfoot game. He's been doing it since the early 60s, and he said, you can't explain one mystery with another. In other words, using like paranormal things to support that Bigfoot is associated with extraterrestrials. Coleman says that's using one mystery to explain another one. Well, I guess my question is, Loren, who made that rule? I think that's your rule, Loren. That's not my rule. There's a lot of examples of actually when that's valid. In 1794, this guy, Schlandi, argued for that meteorites were these objects that fell from space. Well, up until that time, it was steadfastly believed by all the astronomers that existed that no, rocks do not come from space, they burn up. And yet he's going, no, these rocks are from space. So here was one example of something that took a long time to bear out. For over 1,300 years, Ptolemy's view of the solar system was considered factual and reliable, and that is that everything went around the Earth. Then came Galileo, and he got basically squashed. And only when Newton stood up and said the same thing did this idea then find favor, but it took 1,300 years before this idea that was correct was finally embraced. Wegener died before his idea of plate tectonics was ever borne out. It wasn't verified until the 1960s. Wegener was arguing for it in 1919. He died in a plane crash. He never got the satisfaction of knowing that he was correct. This guy at least got to see that his idea, but for 50 years he argued the aurora borealis is caused by the sun. And that was not the view at all. But he showed by living on top of these mountains in Norway all winter long in minus 50-degree temperatures, he was able to show that it was true. Here's a local one. He was ridiculed for a good 40 years before the idea of the Missoula floods were actually found to be correct. He actually, again, got to live to see Vindication, but in the big meeting, one of his grad students said, you got to come to this meeting. They're going to prove you're correct, and all the guys who ridiculed you are going to eat crow. And he said, I'm done with it. I got to go to Costco that day. My wife, I promised her, you know. He didn't go. And this is kind of where Henry Franzoni acts about today, you know, these people who basically decided, I don't care about Vindication anymore, I'm done with this. Anyway, and then the last, or second last, exoplanets, first argued by Charles Fort in 1930. He said these things we see in the sky, they're from somewhere else, but are other planets. There was no acceptance of that idea when he argued it, and then in 1992 the first exoplanet was discovered, and now you probably know that basically by modern astronomical thinking, all stars have planets, 100%. But this is something that's found to be accepted only in the past few years. And the point, of course, sorry it takes so long to make it, is just because you know something to be true, don't be in a hurry for the rest of it. I'm fully expecting to die before the Sasquatch mystery is in any way verified. You know, that's just the way it's happened for most of these other dudes. The Brexes of the world are the lucky ones. And I'm not bitter. Do I sound bitter? Anyway, Skookum Cast, September of 2000. We went out there on Henry Franzoni's encouragement to Skookum Meadow. Name ought to be a clue right there. Our buddy Jim over there was along. I don't see Jim in this picture. But we basically went around leading a film crew from Australia around, and they were basically working on a documentary. So we went around looking for tracks. We played calls into the night. And we actually got a call back, which was pretty compelling, but they didn't record it. We had this really primitive thermal camera. It didn't work for shit. And we did all the usual skulking around, looking for tracks. Well, after like 4 days of this, Jim finally got up. He got fed up. He left. And then finally, last night, and I said, you guys, you're all sneaking around and everything. Consider the possibility that there's another way. And because they weren't getting anything, and the film crew was getting really frustrated with the lack of compelling footage that they're going to use for the show, they said, okay, we're listening. And I said, why don't you do something nice? Why don't you accommodate them? Why don't you put something out there? And we brought all this fruit. Organic, came from my garden, and let's just put it out there. And they said, all right, well, we're going to be driving around with a therm anyway. Fine, we'll take your stupid fruit. And they took it up, they put it in this mud pit next to the road, so not exactly the wilderness, but it is up there near Skookum Meadow. They put the fruit out in this puddle that was drying out, but it was still really muddy. And then they went back and checked it the next morning, and that's when Rick came running back into camp, and I'm just sitting there drinking my coffee, and he's like, you gotta come here, you aren't gonna believe this. And there was this impression in the ground, which Rick Knoll did us the favor of highlighting, so that you can see that you got a heel, presumably, a butt, an arm, and fingers. And so Pete Travers, the same guy who did that Bigfoot sketch project in Cliff's museum, made us this picture which corresponds to the impression you're seeing in the mud. So we didn't get a footprint that we were expecting, but we got this, I mean, everybody call it the ass print. It's really just kind of a thigh and maybe one cheek. and then the arm and the fingers, and the fruit was right there. So the idea was, and they had a hard time wrapping their head around it, that it knew that we were looking for footprints, and it wasn't going to give it to us. So we decided, well, these white people are too stupid. I'm just going to lie down and reach for the fruit, and they're not going to be any the wiser. Leroy actually walked across it. The wildlife biologist, no less, walked across it before Rick Knoll said, wait a minute, back up you guys. And then of course the rest was history. Grover Krantz came and inspected it, and we had what was, you know, at the time being called one of the best pieces of evidence ever gathered. And it may be, although it's not proof. It's just a piece of decent evidence. Anyway, so I wrote a whole story about that, and I sent it to National Geographic, and they sent me a rejection letter, and then they printed it the next month under another author's name. Those are our guys at National Geographic. And so that's when I decided, forget it, I'm done with magazines. And I decided I'm going to put all this in a book anyway. It's probably for my best anyway. So National Geographic, in their own roundabout way, did me a favor, because had they bought it, then I probably would have gotten busy and put it in the book. And so that came to the locals thing, and these are the things that I said back in the day. I said Sasquatches are real, but DNA will never prove it, because it's too similar to ours. It may be identical. They're still saying that. Populations extend continent-wide. Well, duh. Well, in 2003, that was a radical thought, because our guy Peter Byrne was saying no sighting that isn't in the Northwest has any validity. And I'm going, no, they're happening everywhere. They're deliberately hiding. They're very intelligent. They definitely understand cameras, and I found this out from my own experience. And then there's this idea, habituation. I didn't make it up. It's actually sort of a Diane Fossey, Jane Goodall thing having to do with apes. In other words, getting them used to your presence so they act kind of natural. And so now they call it long-term witness, but it's that idea. I did say that there are cover-ups at government levels. Forest Service definitely put the kibosh on this thing. And I found an example of this Sasquatch that had been burned in a forest fire, hadn't been spirited away, yada yada. It's in the book. Anyway, I also said, geez, something's going on with UFOs. I'm not sure what, but Franzoni gave me a ton of stuff on that. And he said that the Sasquatch sightings happen often in association with these other orbs that are floating around. They may not be spacecraft, they may be balls of energy, but you know, they're aerial phenomena. Quickly.
What does the government have to gain by covering it up?
I don't know, but we could go in a whole another hour talking on that. Maybe it's because it's connected to extraterrestrials. Maybe because, you know, it's spotted all times 100. In other words, an endangered species. That's what most people think. But your guess is as good as mine. I do speculate in the chapter. I did have a 13th chapter which wasn't included in the book, in which I said there's communication. And I left it out of the book because our guy Jim over there said, I don't know, Tom. I think you're actually going kind of far out there on a limb. This is only 2003. You might want to shut the fuck up on that. And so I go, oh shit, Jim. All right, you're right. And so I pulled it out. So there was only 12 chapters in the locals. And anyway, I did save the material. And that was chapter 1 or 2 of Edges of Science. And so, you know, again, Jim sort of advised me astutely as far as going, have that be the beginning of your next book, which he did say is the only time I will admit that he was ever right. Anyway.